Hexen 2 is a sequel to one of the most challenging and hardcore shooters of the 1990s, which in itself was a follow-up to one of the best Doom clones of all time, Chex Quest. Nah, I'm kidding son, the game is Heretic, developed by Raven Software, the first in a series where the player has to fight monsters in different dimensions, navigating a dark fantasy setting all whilst taking on the demonic Serpent Riders, otherworldly deities that hop from place to place, causing havoc and mayhem wherever they go, kinda like Rebecca Black. Although Heretic was a pretty basic boomer shooter, by the time I got around to Hexen, and case in point Hexen 2, it really was about as hardcore as first-person shooters ever got. You've got to deal with spongy enemies, puzzles that are often confusing and obtuse, and a game that may or may not even run properly to begin with. And there's a reason why most people don't talk about this thing as much as they talk about other games like Doom or Quake, and that reason is because it really just has filtered the majority of FPS fans. I don't mean that as an insult, and I'm not trying to say it from any kind of high horse, but it really is simply not as accessible. I mean, it wasn't until I was about 16 when I was even able to beat this thing. Playing it back as a kid, I was relegated to just using cheats to skip from level to level because I didn't really know what the hell I was supposed to be doing. It's been a while since I took a look at this though, so I thought an updated review might be in order. An actual proper review too, not just playing through the game with a single class and completely misrepresenting the entire experience, along with modifying game parameters as a result of either the unwillingness or inability to adapt to the game's mechanics. Yeah, I won't be doing that. The cool thing about Heretic and Hexen is that they both take place in different dimensions, which kind of gives the developers carte blanche to create anything they want, not to mention they're not really being tied down to having to link every game together in terms of the characters and the lore. Basically, after the events in Heretic and Hexen, the first two Serpent Riders, Disparel and Corax, have both been killed, now only one remains, named Eidolon. And it seems this guy's pulling out all of the stops, recruiting the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse to do his bidding. Death, Pestilence, War, and T-Pain. You once again choose a class to play as with 4 different options and then progress through 5 episodes, broken down into different hubs as you cut a path through to the final encounter against Eidolon himself. Sadly though, Eidolon does kinda lack the presence that Corax had. What was always really cool about Hexen was how each hub started with Corax appearing for a few seconds to intimidate the player.
My servants can smell your blood, human.
It was really ominous stuff, and it helped to set him up as this foreboding villain, even if the final fight against him was ultimately pretty easy.
Worship me, and I may yet be merciful.
Here though, Eidolon is never really seen or even referenced until you finally encounter him, at which point he just kinda plays out like the other boss fights beforehand. Weak antagonist aside though, in a few key ways, Hexen 2 is really a literal step up from the first game. I mean, for starters, just consider the visuals. Hexen ran on the Doom engine, Hexen 2 runs on the Quake engine. So we've gone from 2D sprites through to these fully 3D models for weapons, enemies, and environments. The Quake engine is really, I think, the only one that could have pulled this off as well, because I think from like the Quake 2 engine onwards, everything just looked almost too smooth and refined. I mean, don't get me wrong, games like Return to Castle Wolfenstein and Quake 3 looked great, and they still do, but there is an element of grit and rawness to the Quake engine that kinda gets lost under things like texture filtering and the higher polygon counts. There is definitely something that gets lost in their transition here from sprites to 3D models, and you could almost argue that it's also lost some of its detail there too. But I think that Hexen 2 still retains that chunky, pixelated aesthetic from the prior 2 games, and it's part of what makes it so visually appealing. To me though, it really does look like a perfect adaptation of Hexen's art style into a fully 3D world. Not to mention the sound effects in this, which are just amazing. Really thick and guttural sound work that makes it feel like your speakers are about to explode. The Quake engine's iconic moving skyboxes also kind of adds to this as well, really capturing the feeling of the player being trapped in this rapidly decaying reality that's been brought to the brink of collapse by the intervention of these corrupt Serpent Riders. The other thing the presentation offers, I think, is a greater variety than the previous game. In Hexen, you move through cursed churches, swamps, forests, caves, and deserts, but it all felt like the same world. It was this dark fantasy backdrop from beginning to end. Hexen 2 though is much more diverse. The first hub, named Black Marsh, is medieval themed, with European looking castles and villages. The second one is then Mesoamerican, the third one is ancient Egyptian, the fourth one is Greco-Roman, and then finally for the fifth hub you're back in the medieval land for the showdown against Big Bad Eidolon. You'll see recurring enemies throughout all of these, but also unique variants depending on the hub itself. You've got were jaguars and giant scorpions in the second, mummies in the third, and then vodka swilling, squatting slabs listening to hard bass in those medieval environments. And it is a pretty big improvement over just fighting the same Ettins, centaurs, and chaos serpents throughout all of Hexen. Especially the centaurs, I mean, fuck those things. Sadly, Hexen 2 has that problem that a lot of other Quake engine games have, which is no in-game soundtrack. The only way you could hear this stuff is if you had the original CD in when you were playing. And that's a damn shame, man, because it's been composed yet again by old mate Kevin Scholder, who might have done some of his best work here. I do like me a good old-fashioned MIDI soundtrack though, and the absence of that here is just a big blow against the whole experience. Hexen 2 brings back a wide variety of items to use as well, items which are equally as important to survival as your weapons can be. Most of these return from Heretic and Hexen, like the quartz flasks which restore your health, and then the tomes of power which buff up all your weapons. But the real game changer is being able to manually map keys to each individual item. Being able to simply press Q in the middle of combat to use a quartz flask for instance, or pressing T to use a tome of power. Or something like G to throw out a Glyph of the Ancients, which is Hexen 2's version of the Flechettes. I actually found myself using discs of propulsion. I actually found myself using the discs of repulsion here a bit, just as a result of being able to map them to a key for quick use. Knocking back projectiles during boss fights, for instance, or knocking enemies into nearby pools of lava, which was always entertaining. There's a few new additions here too, like the Force Cube, which, let's be honest, is pretty much just the Lament configuration from Hellraiser, hovering around the player and firing out lightning bolts. Yeah, too bad it doesn't fire out hooked chains. You can call in a flying demon to help out during combat with the Stone of Summoning, kind of like the Minotaur in Hexen, and instead of turning people into chickens or pigs, you can now turn them into sheep. Yeah, an item that turns people into sheep. It's every New Zealander's wet dream.
Got him!
Raven Software must have learned their lesson after the first game and decided to not port this to any other platforms, which is a good thing considering the PlayStation port for Hexen is comparable to waterboarding. And these new features is something that just wouldn't have worked with the limited buttons on a controller. Most important though in the line of new additions from Hexen 1 is the classes. In Hexen you had the Fighter, the Cleric and the Mage. Now in Hexen 2 it's the Crusader, the Paladin, the Necromancer and the Assassin. Each class again has a starting weapon, which is often about as effective as farting in someone's face, then a second and a third weapon which both use blue and green mana, followed by a fourth super powerful ultimate weapon that has two parts that need to be found before it can be used, and feeds on both mana types at once, like some kind of greedy gold digging whore. You can also see how some elements of the original classes have carried over here too. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the Fighter and the Paladin are the same thing. For starters, they both have gauntlets as starting weapons. The Fighter's second weapon was the magically infused Timon's Axe, then in Hexen 2, it's the magically infused Vorpal Sword. The Hammer of Retribution fires out flaming hammer projectiles, the Axe fires out flaming axe projectiles. The only difference for the fourth weapon is instead of a flaming sword, the Paladin gets the Purifier, which, still not sure if it's supposed to be a staff or a spear. The Necromancer is kinda similar to the Mage as well. His starting weapon is a Scythe though, which is about as far removed from the Mage's Sapphire one as you could possibly get, but his two main weapons, again, are both different elemental spells. He's got the Magic Missiles, an RPG classic, and the Bone Shards. He even holds his right hand up when casting them, similar to the Mage's Frost Shards and the Arc of Death in the first game. Plus, I really love that detail too, how he kinetically turns the pages on his little spellbook when swapping through them. They also share something else in common in that they've both got the worst fourth weapon in the game. Just like Bloodscourge in Hexen, the Necromancer's fourth weapon is the Raven Staff, which fires out 3 projectiles, just like Bloodscourge did. Ironically though, with this one, you want to be as close to enemies as possible so each projectile hits, but with Bloodscourge you'd want to try and stay back to give the projectiles room to spread out and home in on enemies. Still though, both of these are just really woeful, and you may as well just flush your mana points down the toilet, because that's about as effective as using both of these things. Moving on, you've got the Crusader, which is again kinda similar to the Cleric. Both are men of faith, They both share the patrician fetish of face-sitting, and both begin their biblical journey with nothing more than a good bit of steel in their hands. The cleric had the mace of attrition, the crusader has his hammer. His second weapon is an ice staff, the cleric's was the serpent staff. And the ice staff is easily one of the most cost-effective weapons in the entire game. It only uses 1 mana per shot, it can turn enemies into ice, and on top of that, it's ranged. I mean, that right there is what we call a triple threat. With the Tome of Power, this thing fires out mini blizzards which hover around enemies doing damage over time, like a fart trapped in a phone booth. Even his third weapon, the Meteor Staff, which is the closest thing we get to a rocket launcher, absolutely tears ass. Yeah, you can actually see asses being teared in real time here. And again, elementally, it's similar to the Cleric's Firestorm. With the Tome of Power, this thing turns into some kind of tornado launcher, shooting out mini tornadoes that home in on nearby enemies, then swirl them around like pocket change caught in a tumble dryer. Even this dude's starting weapon gets the best Tome of Power upgrade. I mean, normally that hammer's really only good for whacking nails and cracking walnuts. But with the Tome of Power, you can now throw this thing at enemies, even doing lightning damage on contact. Then they both have arguably the best fourth weapon in each game. The Cleric has Wraith Verge, of course, which is easily one of the most powerful weapons in any first-person shooter. This thing fires out a ball of super pissed off ghosts, which then split up and rip everything to pieces. The Crusaders is the Lightbringer, which doesn't hold a candle to Wraith Verge, but does fire out this constant stream of holy light, which does great damage and also happens to bounce off walls. It uses way less mana than the other fourth weapons, but more importantly, it's a constant stream, which is handy because the improved AI in this game has enemies often dodging left and right to avoid your projectiles at times. Then finally, we've got the new addition, the Assassin, who is probably the most specialized class in the entire game, sharing pretty much bugger all similarities with the classes from Hexen, being given a katana, a crossbow, and grenades as her basic weapons, along with some weaponized cleavage. Now, the crossbow is decent enough, I guess it's just kind of basic. The grenades, on the other hand, do a lot of damage, but now you've got to contend with the physics of throwing them, along with, like I mentioned before, the capacity for enemies to avoid them. On top of that too, you've got to contend with these horrible hitboxes, where the grenades are going to often just pass right through enemies for no apparent reason. The fourth weapon is the Staff of Set. Yeah, another staff, which kind of looks like the Phoenix Staff from Heretic, even down to the textures of it and it being aligned to the center of the screen. And this, I think, is probably the most powerful weapon in the game. You can hold down the fire button and charge it up, shooting out this really strong projectile that pretty much one-shots all of the basic enemies. It just kind of furthers my point a bit, how she's really the most specialized class in the entire game. What's also cool is the new leveling up system they've added in, and this one actually has a purpose throughout the game. Yeah. Right, so as you kill enemies, you earn XP, and after a certain amount of XP, you level up, much like any other RPG. Not only are you upgrading your maximum health and mana in small increments as you level up, but each class then has 2 specific abilities they unlock at certain levels. The Paladin, for instance, gets the ability to breathe underwater. The Necromancer can absorb the souls of fallen enemies like his Shang Tsung or something. And the Crusader can absorb Holy Strength because, yeah, that makes sense. The Assassin probably has the most useless one of all. She can go invisible after a few seconds if she stands still. And then also backstab enemies for extra damage, like a typical RPG stealth attack. Though the only time I ever backstab anyone was during the boss fights, because I could just run behind one of the horsemen and stab him in the arse over and over. Otherwise though, these are pretty useless for 2 reasons. Firstly, this isn't a stealth game. Enemies rarely have their backs turned to you, they're almost always looking straight ahead, so forget ever backstabbing anything. And secondly, as soon as you move, that invisibility goes away anyway, so it's just completely pointless. If enemies patrolled around or something maybe, well, it might have been useful, but it really just feels like a concept that was never fully fleshed out. Now, I've read people defending the Assassin online because they think she's bad on purpose, you know what I mean, to make the game more challenging or something. But that's like wearing a blindfold when you're driving an F1 car. I mean, yeah, sure, it makes the game more challenging, but why not just crash that car into a wall without the blindfold and call it a day? I guess my point is if you're going to play this thing for the first time, don't start with the Assassin. I do like too though how the motivations for each class is different now. I mean, in the first game, these guys were just pretty much clear-cut good guys. Their entire goal was just to find and destroy Korax and save the world. This is again the case for the Paladin and the Crusader, both of whom are lawful good chads who are just simply trying to destroy Eidolon because it's the most noble course of action. However, the Assassin and the Necromancer are a little bit different. The Assassin simply wants to kill Eidolon because it's a challenge. Stealing from the rich and powerful and trading cryptocurrency, I guess, is just no longer exciting. So now she's going after the biggest target she's probably ever faced, aside from the internal tax revenue. I guess going off those old alignment charts, that'd make her neutral evil, right? Versus the chaotic evil Necromancer, with his knack for collecting souls and his lust for power, decides to go after Eidolon simply because he's been overshadowed now as the biggest asshole in the land.
You are the leading asshole in the state.
Yeah, according to the game manual, he was already tormenting innocent people before the events of the game. Kinda sounds like people on Twitter who have single-digit followers. And since Eidolon's a rival, no one gives two shits about him. Kinda like people on Twitter with single-digit followers. Now these were just paragraph-long summaries in that ancient relic known as a video game manual, but it just gave these characters a bit more depth, and it made it more than just playing as cookie-cutter good guys. It kinda helps to make the game feel that little bit more like an RPG, which I think it really does. Finally, of course, we get to the real meat of the game, and that's the level design itself, with all of its ridiculous puzzles. And I really do think this trumps anything in the first game by far. I think I summed up how confusing the puzzles are in my original video that I made a few years back, and truthfully, I don't think I can outdo that.
Then it's just a simple matter of knowing that the teleporter to King Logos Crypt is hidden under the bridge along the path that leads to the windmill and the wizard lab, at which point you can simply grab the remains, grind them at the mill, complete the ritual at your wizard's lab, and Bob's your uncle.
Come again.
But it can't be overstated how fucking confusing this game can be at times. I mean, let's consider in that starting hub alone, right? Your first immediate set of tasks, in no particular order, is to gain access to a castle, defeat a crystal golem, create a magical lens to pass through a mystical archway, uncover the remains of a deceased king, grind the remains down, and then use them to make a potion to find a key in a hidden passage underneath a castle. Along the way, you'll need to find multiple keys, read journals for clues, and be astute enough to notice the hints given away these secret rooms and passageways, whilst also dealing with the constant threat of archers, golems, and spiders which are waiting around every single corner. Fuck. You also have to literally read some of these clues, or else it's not going to trigger items or secrets to appear. Like at one point there's a hidden passage behind a fireplace, but you can only see the switch once you've found a journal that tells you it's there. The switch is literally going to appear out of nowhere only after you've read this specific entry. It's like the way this game is skating this thin line between being obtuse, but also giving you just enough of an indication as to where you should be looking. Still feels like trying to find a needle in a haystack, only they were at least nice enough to tell you which side of the haystack to start on. Now look, I might just be saying this because of how utterly biased I am, but I do think the first two hubs aren't that bad. At this early point in the game, it's really just about finding items and then bringing them to specific locations. And if you're searching everywhere, sooner or later you'll eventually find what you need. This might take you 5 minutes or it might take you 5 hours, but you're gonna find it. In the second hub, you need to pass 4 tests to collect 4 elements: earth, fire, wind, and water. Yeah, all that's missing is Heart and Captain Planet coming out of the ground like an arsehole. Along with 2 crystal skulls, which gives me PTSD about how awful that 4th Indiana Jones movie was. But again, look, if you're searching each area thoroughly, well, I think you're gonna eventually find what you need. The main obstacle in this second hub is going to be the were panthers and were jaguars, which I guess are people who turn into anthropomorphic panthers and jaguars during a full moon or something. I mean, I don't know much about that kind of stuff, but I can guess it's probably a furry's wet dream. But anyway, these enemies are easily the toughest part of the second hub because they've got a lot more health points than you used to, with even this roaring animation where they become invulnerable for a short period of time. I don't think the game ever states that they're immune to damage here either. I mean, you'll probably figure that out on your own though after sinking a few dozen mana points into them and noticing that it's doing jack shit. They're really just a bit of a distraction when you're trying to solve the next puzzle or find that next crucial item, because otherwise, these dexterous pricks aside, this hub ain't too confusing. It's that third hub in Egypt though where it starts to get really fucked up, because not only do you need to go on that treasure hunt again for all these crucial items, but then there's also specific conditions you need to meet on top of it all. At one point in this hub you need to time travel 1,000 years back into the past, and then set an astrological calendar to a specific constellation. Then do the same for one in the present time or else a scripted sequence isn't going to occur. And I have no idea how you're supposed to know this without checking a walkthrough. There's also a puzzle here that I've never been able to beat without cheating. Basically, you come across this marking on a wall which shows a specific pathway you need to take when grabbing an item. You're supposed to move across these 3 panels in a specific order, but I've got no idea how you're supposed to do it. I've tried doing this from every single direction, trying every combination, but every time I do it, I seem to get it wrong, and it teleports me outside of the building to try again.
Bullshit!
This, I think, is definitely the most challenging part of the entire game, and if you got up to this bit and then gave up from the confusion, well, I wouldn't blame you. The puzzles do get easier from the 4th hub and onward, but then the issue from here is that the enemies all get a serious buff in health points. The 4th hub takes place in the Greco-Roman setting, although instead of adding in that many new enemy types, it just brings back some familiar faces, and this time they're a lot tougher. In the 1st hub it was common to see lots of these archers, now they're back as Archer Lords, which is exactly the same, only now they're a different colour. It's like playing Golden Axe or Streets of Rage and just seeing enemies with palette swaps. I mean, as an example of how spongy these enemies are now, in that 1st hub these guys have about 80 health points, right? Now in the 4th hub, these lords have 325. Yeah, over 4 times the amount. 4 times plus 5. I think you encountered maybe a handful of these Archer Lords in the 1st hub, but now they're basically the most recurring enemy you're going to see. And unless you want to spend all this time whittling their health down with your first 2 weapons, which takes forever, chances are you're going to be impatient like me, and you're going to want to kill them as quickly as possible with your 4th weapon, which means you are going to burn through mana here like nobody's business. Mana pickup's also seem a lot rarer in this 4th hub, and it almost feels like you need to save up all of your craters of might for this one episode, or else you're going to be up shit creek. Yeah, a creek full of shit. I should probably add too that the Craters of Might are an item that instantly refill your mana to its maximum, so having a dozen of these bad boys on standby is pretty handy. It's also the exact same thing with the spiders, who again make a return. This time though, instead of black spiders, they're red, and instead of having 75 health points, they've now got 175. At least though these things aren't too bad though. I mean, I'm from Australia, we invented spiders. Hexen 2 has 4 difficulty modes, with it kind of being like normal, hard, very hard, and then go fuck yourself. And I've always thought that the 2nd difficulty here feels the most balanced, with the 3rd one just being kind of needlessly challenging. Simply because this 3rd one adds in way more enemies, which for a game that's already stringent on ammo becomes even more stringent, as you can imagine. I've always kind of looked at Hexen 2 as a puzzle game first and foremost though. It's like playing Resident Evil to me, where the enemies are more of an obstacle in the way of you completing the next task that the game's thrown at you. The challenge comes from trying to find all of these clues and then figure out where things are supposed to be going. So, funnily enough, the boss fights I think are the easiest encounters in the entire game. Do you know how to circle strafe along with activating a Tome of Power, and also using Discs of Repulsion at just the right time? Well, then you've just beaten every boss fight here. Visually, these are pretty awesome though, and I love that effect when you beat these guys and all of these rays of light shine out of them before they completely dissipate. But they're just pretty simple arena fights in these large opened up areas with conveniently placed items, and easily the most basic aspect in the entire campaign. I have often kind of wondered if Hexen 2 was a game that got rushed to completion, because the last hub of the game when you're back in Black Marsh before the final fight against Eidolon is incredibly simple when it comes to the puzzles. And it just kind of feels like at that point that they got over the development cycle and just wanted to wrap the whole thing up. There's even an old GameSpot review from back in 1997, and even in that, the guy reviewing it says the same thing. How he thinks the whole experience also feels a bit rushed. It all kind of harks back to the assassin having these abilities that really serve no purpose whatsoever. Was it their intention to work these into the game in a more meaningful way and they just never got around to it? Then also consider that apparently they were going to give the Necromancer the ability to bring enemies back from the dead. You know, like an actual Necromancer. And these whispers like this about mechanics and the features that never saw the light of day is what makes Hexen 2 so interesting to me. Considering that what came after this was a pretty standard third-person shooter, which really felt like an entirely different series at this point. I feel like things maybe got too confusing and complex, so Raven Software just thought they'd scale things right back again, and make Heretic 2 much more similar to the origins for the series. Maybe just including that third-person perspective as a way to mix things up a bit.
Heroic.
I don't know if extra time spent would have made the game better off or not, but either way, Hexen 2 has gone down as being one of the toughest first-person shooters ever made, and that's a reputation well earned. And while I do think it's an awesome game, I don't think I'd ever say that it's a masterpiece. But I do think the people who managed to beat this without a walkthrough should be preserved for the rest of time. Like, if there's ever a meteor that's gonna crash into the planet and destroy mankind, well, we should get all these people into some kind of underground bunker and protect them to ensure they can help to preserve the future of our species. But you know what I say about the whole thing? I say give it a go, right? What's the worst that can happen? Because when it comes to games that let you hit people in the face with swords, hammers, or magic spells, well, Hexen 2 is still about as good as it gets.
Got him!